Welcome to the Canadian Ecopsychology Network monthly virtual gathering. Hello, my name is Carol Koziel and I'm the founder of CEN. Today, Roger Duncan joins us from the UK. Roger is a registered systemic psychotherapist who works with children and adolescents in the NHS and in private practice with individuals, families, and organizations. And today, Roger is going to talk to us about his latest book, Nature in Mind, Systemic Thinking and Imagination in Ecopsychology and Mental Health. Welcome,
Great.
Roger. I look forward to this conversation.
Great. Thanks, Carol. It's really great to be here. Really fantastic to meet you people and have a conversation with you.
Super. So, Roger, can you just kind of give us a description of what this book is about and how you came up with the idea?
Yeah. I mean, it's the book has been a long time in coming. And, I've been working with adolescents and nature-based practice in some form or other for 30 years plus. I'm originally a biologist, and my connection with nature was very heartfelt. And when I studied biology at university, I realized that what my connection with nature, the thing I was looking for, wasn't there in biology. It somehow got lost with the kind of scientific methodology. So that took me, I got interested in other ways of other philosophies, if you like, other cultures. Did some traveling, spent some time with indigenous people in Africa that I describe in the book, and then I studied as a Steiner teacher, a Rudolf Steiner teacher, and then I spent about 18 years in a project in the UK where we worked with adolescents outside. And what I did in particular was I did woodland management with young people. So we were managing woodlands sustainably as we could, and also developed wilderness experience programs in Scotland, and also trained as a Vision Quest guide during that time with Lost Borders. And so that kind of opened up my view. And then about 10 years ago, I trained as a systemic psychotherapist. And at a certain point, about 3 years ago, I thought, actually, I've run out of excuses not to write this book. I'm going to have to put it all together. So that's what I've done.
Super, thank you. That's a very broad background.
Yeah.
So one of the themes that I'm struck with coming through is your weaving of the creatural and the imaginal in nature, psychotherapy, and the physical world. Can you just kind of give us a layman's review of what that's about?
Yeah. I mean, the creatorial is something that Bateson describes, and he describes these two different worlds: the world which we can conceptualize and we can see, which is basically the world we live in, world of language, education, science. And then he talks about this other world, which has no concepts and is invisible, and it only has relationships. And he says this is the world that connects the psyche, our inner world, and nature. In other words, they're running on the same program, as it were. And he also says that it has a language, and if we learn to understand that language, then we're thinking as nature thinks, as it were, but we're not using concepts. So it's a pretty deep dive into philosophy. But what it is, when we experience it, when we spend time in nature, when we get in touch with our bodies, when we're in relationship with other people, there's a sense of some connection, which is a felt sense, really. And I think my studies of Indigenous people and my experience of Vision Quest is that there's something that Indigenous people were trying to explain to to Western culture, which what Western culture just couldn't get because they were locked into this conceptual world. And
the creatorial and imaginal, you talk about the communication between these. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think the communication, I mean, I suppose another way of thinking about it is in psychotherapy, because in a way, psychotherapy, and particularly, you know, the deeper aspects of psychotherapy, have taken on board the imaginal world, which is something that emerges between people in a session. It's not necessarily a thing. It's not necessarily a conceptualization. It's a felt sense experience, and what you get from that is an insight, aha moment. And in that is new information, but again, it's not conceptual information. And this is very similar, I think, to what we can sometimes get when we're in contact with the natural world. You get a sort of aha of what's going on. And I suppose what I've done, you know, for the last 18 years or so before I moved into the NHS, was I worked with young people, and what we did was we took young people into nature and we worked with them in nature, not explicitly educationally, not explicitly therapeutically, because we put work in the center. In other words, we put physical engagement with the natural world, and we conceptualize that, you know, within an education setting or a therapeutic setting. But it wasn't therapy or education directly. We weren't teaching people. We were just we were working with them. And through that process, young people got insights about themselves. And the insights came really in this in-between space, I think, between themselves and nature. So for instance, you know, when you engage a young person in a task, whether it's moving wood or chopping a tree down or digging a hole or whatever it is, moving a wheelbarrow, they have an interaction. They have a physical interaction with what they're engaging with, and that gives them insight into themselves and how they engage in the world, which is very different from what you get from, say, virtual reality and computer games, that kind of thing.
So building on that, on page 48, you talk about the three-way relationship between the client person, the therapist, teacher, and nature,
Yeah.
and how the therapist or teacher moves between facilitating and witnessing.
Right. So, so this is something that comes from Ronan Berger from Israel. He talks about the third object. And what's interesting about that conceptualization is the third object is nature. But again, if you step into an imaginal language, it's not an object. It's not a concept. It's actually, you know, there's quite a lot of research that I put in the book about the beingness of nature, that nature's not a passive background. It's actually an agent. And again, you see that in synchronicities. So when you're in that role, again, you're working with a young person. So in that three-way relationship, you've got the young person and their difficulties or issues or whatever it is. You've got yourself as the teacher stroke therapist, and they're engaged in a task or an interaction. And what might happen is, you know, the thing that they're doing might collapse or it might go a different way. And you could step in as a teacher and say, oh, well, that, you know, should be like this. Or you can just allow that interaction between that young person to happen. And I suppose the thing about the reason I've spent so much time getting the conceptualization of the imaginal so clear is because once you've got it, then you can see that moment and you know when you need to step back. And again, it's very similar to when you're doing vision quest work and soul work. Quite often you want us to step in there and fix something, but actually it's always, in my experience, it's always best to step out and allow that emergent process to play out, because it has a wisdom in it. It has a value which no amount of thinking is going to actually improve on.
So you just identified a very unique skill that how do you train to intuitively know when to facilitate and when to witness?
Well, that's a really good question, because that's kind of why I've been written the book, because I think it's very easy for it's very and I I've done that myself, to be too interactive or too sorry, the light's going here, which is just put the lights up. Um, yeah, intrusive. But once you have the idea of the imaginal, of of nature, as an interactive being, then you can step out. But I suppose the other thing I put in there is the idea of using the nature-based mapping tools, and I put Bill Plotkin's map, the Circle of Courage, and the Lost Borders model. And again, all of those models are quite different from Western cultural models, because what they mark is this position of soul encounter, which is where you bump into an imaginal reality. Whether you have whether you know that or not, but as a facilitator, you can say, oh, this experience could be really valuable. I'm going to just step out of the way rather than intervene here, because you're looking for that and again, what I call from a systemic process is systemic change, systemic phase change, where something different happens. An experience I had, which is kind of, which is a little bit, sums up this a little bit, is working with a young man where we were sawing wood, and with a handsaw, double-handed saw, crosscut saw, and he said, "Oh, I should really get fit. I should really get more fit." And what happened? He's experienced my strength and stamina. He experienced the resistance in the wood through his body, and had an insight about himself. And I didn't need to. My task was, we're cutting the wood and making it safe for him. But actually, through that process, through the wood, me, the saw, he had an insight about himself, which wasn't facilitated by me. I was the witness.
Thank you for clarifying that. So can you speak to more about soul encounters?
Okay, well, soul encounter is something that Bill Plotkin talks about. I think it's come out of the Vision Fast stream, if you like, that kind of Lost Borders, Animus Valley, which is the experience of, again, it's that experience of aha. You have an insight about yourself. And what Bill Plotkin makes the distinction between soul initiation and soul encounter, where soul initiation is where, for instance, that boy says, "I need to get fit." That he's touching something. He's encountering something of his own soul in relation to the world. The soul initiation would be, actually, I'm going to get fit. Actually, I'm going to leave school and I'm going to go to the gym and I'm going to become a personal trainer and I'm going to and his whole life pivots at that moment. And that's I think, as a teacher and as a therapist, that's what we're doing. And in terms of the whole ecological movement, ecopsychology movement, it's for me, it's really about facilitating those moments where someone can change their life and go, you know what, I will do whatever it is that's more positive.
So how do you facilitate a soul encounter that's not total wilderness based? Not everyone can get away to do vision quests and vision fasts.
Right.
What's our work here?
Okay, well, that's again another very interesting question, because you see, what's slightly strange about me is I started working in a very left field, in Steiner education. I worked in a sort of outdoor education center, and now I've gone into mainstream. In later life, I've gone actually right into the mainstream NHS culture. So I'm working with adolescents in in a clinical setting with strip lighting and plastic chairs. And I'm often saying to myself, well, why am I out in the woods? Well, I couldn't reach those kids out in the woods because we don't have a program where they're getting sent out. They're getting sent to a clinical setting. But and again, this is one of the reasons I wrote the book, is once we have a picture, it's not a concept, a picture of or a sense of the imaginal, then you can work with the imaginal anywhere, because it's a part of the reality. So it's that moment of, and the other thing about the imaginal that is, and I can't remember where this comes from. I think it comes from Jung, actually. That it's transgressive. The imaginal is transgressive. So again, you have this experience from vision quests where you have a dream about an animal, and you go out into nature, and there's the animal from your dream, or you have a conversation and then you meet it out in real life. So there's something about these images that have no, they don't really recognize the boundary. They don't recognize human-made boundaries. They just move from psyche to nature, psyche to nature to psyche. So in a clinical setting, once you have the concept of the imaginal, it's possible to work as a systemic psychotherapist, I believe, with the body, because you're looking at body movements, you're looking at how someone's inhabiting their body. You can work with imagination, with images, with synchronistic events, or synchronistic comments that come up in the session. So you move from a kind of a systemic or conventional, if you like, psychotherapeutic situation to something that's far more Jungian, because actually these imaginal shapes show up in a clinical setting, and that's pretty wild. You're not out in the wilderness, but actually, of course, we have a wilderness inside our own soul. And by wilderness, I don't mean that the derogatory wilderness. I mean the wildness. I mean the soul, the more than human, or the more than just the conceptualized.
So were you just kind of describing the transference and counter-transference?
Yeah, I think so, because those are terms within psychotherapy that describe what happens between a client and a patient. Something moves in between, one way and backwards and forwards. And because we live in a sort of post-Descartesian world, the idea, we tend to, the world tends to be conceptualized as mechanistic and dead. So that's fine for people to have a felt sense between each other. But once you get into a felt sense of, well, I had this feeling about the tree, or I had this feeling of a little bird that came into my garden, then you've moved right outside of the Western conceptualized framework, and you're into some kind of something that people can't really understand so easily. But again, with the concept of the imaginal, that becomes pretty straightforward, because actually, there is that transference and counter-transference going on all the time. But within that, you have to take on board the fact that nature is not just a blank canvas. It's actually an inanimate pattern of beings that are communicating with us, which is what indigenous people have been saying for ages and ages, and Western people couldn't get their heads around it, basically.
On page 100, you have an interesting quote. From an ecopsychology perspective, we are all still recovering refugees from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle.
Okay. Well, this is a nice one, because again, this was triggered, I think, by Chellis's book. My name's Chellis, and I'm in recovery from Western civilization. The more I worked with trauma, and understanding trauma and some of the more recent research on trauma, I sort of it began to become clearer in my mind of this idea that we are, the whole Western project is one that's been created by traumatized Indigenous people. We are those traumatized Indigenous people. What we're seeing now is Indigenous people suffering from epistemicide and being taken from the land and losing their language. And sometimes we forget that actually that happened to us. That happened to particularly in the UK, I think, historically. And of course, those people who were separated from the land then went out to colonize other people, and that's the whole Canadian American and, a lot of the colonial story is in that. So, if you think about trauma, what happens is we tend to, trauma tends to get repeated unless it's processed. So there's a narrative that, if we've been separated from the land, then when we see people that are connected with the land, then we will either idolize them or we'll want to kill them. And that's exactly the story of this relationship between the developed world and Indigenous people that goes on today. And we're now in this position of saying, well, we want to get back to being in connection with nature, but we're stuck in this conceptualized paradigm of what our relationship is with nature, and it's a very tight model. So it's very difficult to get out of. It's very difficult to find another way of thinking about that, I think.
You've used the acronym WEIRD culture throughout your book. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I really like this one because this comes from Jared Diamond, who's an anthropologist, and he describes the Western culture. In his book, The Day Until Yesterday, I think it's called, he describes the difference between developed culture and Indigenous cultures, and says basically the Indigenous cultures have sorted out a lot of the socio and economic issues that we struggle with, and did it for a very, very long time. And then he describes Western culture as Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And again, that's another interesting conceptualization, because it enables us to talk about Western culture in a boundaried way, as opposed to non-Western cultures, which are rapidly being squashed by the WEIRD narrative. So
what's the antidote to WEIRD culture?
Well, I think that's part of what I've written in my book. Is the antidote is recognizing recognizing the imaginal, working with this imaginal. That again, these very sophisticated thinkers have come up with, Bateson and Henri Corbin and Rudolf Steiner, and they've used that in various social enterprises to try and change this whole narrative. So, for instance, Steiner education, Waldorf education, is the legacy of Steiner's work. Systemic family therapy, a lot of the systems work, is the legacy of Bateson's work, and deep psychotherapy is really the legacy of Corbin's work through Jung and James Hillman and that kind of thing. The bit for me is the nature, because I'm a biologist, is the nature bit. So once you bring the imaginal into nature, suddenly the whole world starts to get animated in a way that Indigenous people have been telling us about for hundreds of years. And we don't need to sort of steal their culture to get it, because actually it's right there in front of us in WEIRD thinking. It's just about joining the dots. And the antidote is really spending time in nature, spending prolonged time in nature, because you know what happens in nature if you spend a lot of time there is you first of all you are healed in many ways. First of all, autonomically, the autonomic nervous system calms down. We know that now. There's a lot of research into that. We begin to feel this kinship with nature, and then when you step beyond that, in those developmental mats into the soul encounter, you can have a deep therapeutic experience with nature. And again, it's not it's outside of this conceptual framework. It's much more of a soul experience. And again, we know from Vision Quest work that that's very slow. It takes a long time. You know, you can have an insight on a Vision Quest, or just even, as I said, soaring the wood, but that sinks in very, very slowly and begins to change us from the inside out. And of course, it was those soul encounter experiences that kept Indigenous people grounded in their own culture and their own way of seeing the world. And there's quite a lot of evidence that people who hadn't experienced that were, dangerously off-piste. And then you look at weird culture and you go, oh, that's interesting. We are dangerously off-piste, and we don't have a method for connecting with nature other than through the scientific process, which is, again, conceptualize nature as a mechanical, mechanistically, really. And of course, we have the same thing in psychology, that in a worst case scenario, that the medical model conceptualizes the human psyche as a mechanical model, and then we wonder why we're disconnected, or we wonder why the adolescents that grow up in this culture are disconnected. And what they search for a deep soul connection, which they often find through drugs, or heightened stimulation, because there's nothing else available in our culture, because it's kind of flat. We've kind of flattened it out with our weird conceptualization of what the project's really about. I mean, one of the images I've thought about quite a lot, if we think about nature as an interactive system, it's like giving our adolescents high-powered laptops connected to the internet, and telling them it's an electric typewriter. And when they get a connection to the internet, you just say, oh yeah, that's just a mistake. That's just a glitch in the system. It's an electric typewriter. Get on and write your homework. But in fact, we are all plugged into this massive, in a way, the internet is a mechanical image of what nature is really about. And again, that's what Indigenous people have been saying for a long time. It's a very complex, interactive system of beings, and we're just one of them.
Thank you so much, Roger. I think we'll finish here and open it up to the floor.